Look up at the sky and imagine a continuous, deafening roar that vibrates through your chest. A sound generated by 6,000 heavy radial engines, synchronized in a singular, terrifying purpose. Imagine an aluminium overcast so dense it physically blocks out the sun, casting a shadow of impending doom over an entire city. We are talking about a scale of aerial armada that the world had never seen before, and frankly, a concentration of conventional strategic firepower that we will likely never see again. We are diving into the grim, mathematically precise, and brutally efficient machinery of the Allied strategic bombing campaign in early 1945. Specifically, we are looking at the unleashing of over 1,500 heavy bombers upon the German city of Dresden. But before we dissect the formations, the bomb loads, and the sheer logistical miracle required to put that much aluminum and high explosive into the freezing European sky, I want to ask you a question. How do you break the back of an industrialized empire that refuses to surrender, even when its front lines are collapsing? If you want to understand the cold, hard calculus of total war, you are in the right place. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join our community of military history analysts as we break down the tactics, the technology, and the raw firepower that shaped the modern world. To understand the total annihilation of Dresden, we cannot simply look at the dates of February 13th to the 15th, 1945. We have to strip away the decades of post-war political debate and look at the strategic reality on the ground and in the air through the eyes of the military commanders at that exact moment in time. The strategic context of early 1945 was one of absolute grinding attrition. The Third Reich was bleeding out, but it was still a highly lethal, cornered animal. In the West, the American and British forces had just survived the brutal shock of the Ardennes offensive, better known to us as the Battle of the Bulge. That massive German counterattack had cost the United States Army over 80,000 casualties and served as a bloody reminder that the Wehrmacht, though depleted, still possessed formidable operational capability and fanatical resolve. In the east, the Soviet Red Army had just launched the massive Vistula-Oder offensive in January. Millions of Soviet troops were storming toward Berlin, but they were facing fierce resistance and relying heavily on extended supply lines. The Western Allies needed a way to accelerate the collapse of the German war machine and facilitate the Soviet advance. This brings us to a fundamental concept in American military doctrine, one that traces its roots all the way back to the American Civil War. Think about General William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea in 1864. Sherman did not just target the Confederate Army. He targeted the infrastructure, the rail lines, the factories, and the agricultural base that allowed that army to function. He brought the psychological and physical reality of war to the enemy's doorstep. The Allied strategic bombing campaign was the 20th century evolution of that exact same doctrine, scaled up to an industrial level and projected through the third dimension of the sky. By targeting the German logistical hubs, the marshalling yards, and the industrial centers, the United States Army Air Forces and the British Royal Air Force were executing a vertical march to the sea. Dresden was not chosen out of thin air. It was a primary communications center, a massive railway hub, and a key administrative city for the German defense of the Eastern Front. The German National Railway, the Reichsbahn, funneled troops, ammunition, and armored reserves through Dresden's massive marshalling yards to reinforce the rapidly crumbling lines against the Soviets. If you paralyze Dresden, you sever the central artery supplying the German forces opposing the Red Army. You have to ask yourself, what is the tactical value of a German panzer division if its replacement tanks and artillery shells are trapped on a burning train 200 miles behind the front? The answer is zero. A tank without fuel and ammunition is just a very expensive, heavily armored pillbox. Let us break down the correlation of forces and the industrial behemoths that were about to clash in the skies over Saxony. On one side, you have the United States Army Air Forces, specifically the mighty 8th Air Force, based in England, commanded by Lieutenant General Jimmy Doolittle, operating under the strategic direction of General Carl Spaatz. The American doctrine was built entirely around daylight precision bombing. The theory, developed at the Air Corps Tactical School in the 1930s, posited that heavily armed high-altitude bombers flying in tight, mutually supporting formations could fight their way to any target, destroy it with pinpoint accuracy using the highly classified Norden bomb sight, and fight their way home. The primary instrument of this doctrine was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, specifically the G model by 1945. The B-17G was a marvel of American engineering and industrial standardization. Powered by 4 Wright R1820-97 Cyclone turbocharged radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, the Fortress could carry a bomb load of 4,800 pounds over long distances at altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet. But its true defining characteristic was its defensive armament. A single B-17G bristled with 13 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns. These weapons fired a heavy, armor-piercing incendiary projectile at a cyclic rate of about 800 rounds per minute. When you stack 36 of these bombers into a standard combat box formation, you are creating a flying porcupine, capable of projecting a concentrated field of interlocking heavy machine gun fire that was absolutely lethal to intercepting fighter aircraft. Alongside the B-17 was the Consolidated B-24 Liberator, which actually carried a heavier bomb load and flew faster, though it was somewhat more vulnerable to battle damage than the famously rugged Fortress. But the American doctrine of unescorted daylight bombing had been drowned in blood over the skies of Schweinfurt and Regensburg in 1943. The Luftwaffe had proven that even the most heavily armed bomber formations could be decimated without fighter escort. This brings us to the technological silver bullet of the American air campaign, the North American P-51D Mustang. By mating a sleek, aerodynamically advanced American airframe with the legendary British-designed, American-built Packard V1-6507 Merlin engine, the Allies created a fighter that could outturn and outrun almost anything the Germans had, while sipping fuel at a rate that allowed it to fly all the way to Berlin, loiter, and fly back. Equipped with external drop tanks, the Mustang provided the 8th Air Force with something unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare, which was absolute, continuous air superiority from the English Channel to the heart of the Reich. Contrast this immense American daylight capability with the British Royal Air Force Bomber Command, led by Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris. The British had abandoned daylight bombing early in the war due to unsustainable losses. Their doctrine shifted to nighttime area bombing. If the Americans were using a scalpel, albeit a very large, blunt scalpel, the British were using a sledgehammer. The RAF relied on the magnificent Avro Lancaster, a 4-engine heavy bomber that could carry an astonishing 14,000 pounds of ordnance, nearly 3 times the typical long-range load of a B-17. The British tactic was to fly in a bomber stream at night, relying on darkness for protection, and saturate an entire industrial or urban area with a mix of high explosives to blow off roofs and shatter water mains, followed by massive quantities of incendiaries to ignite the exposed structures. Now, look at the defenders. The German Luftwaffe in early 1945 was a shadow of the force that had terrorized Europe in 1940. The German integrated air defense system, once the most sophisticated in the world, was fracturing. Historically, we can compare the collapse of the German air defense network to the degradation of the Iraqi integrated air defenses during Operation Desert Storm in 1991. Once the command and control nodes are blinded and the interceptors are grounded by a lack of fuel or destroyed on the runway, the defense becomes localized, sporadic, and ultimately futile. The Luftwaffe still possessed lethal interceptors, including the Focke-Wulf Fw-190 and the revolutionary Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. The Me 262, armed with four 30mm Mk108 cannons, could tear a B-17 apart in a single pass. However, the German war machine was suffering from terminal logistical starvation. The Allied bombing of Romanian oil fields and synthetic fuel plants had choked off the Luftwaffe's lifeblood. German pilots were grounded not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked aviation gas. Furthermore, the relentless attrition of the air war had wiped out the Luftwaffe's experienced veteran pilots. They were throwing teenagers with barely 50 hours of flight time into the cockpits of high-performance aircraft against American fighter pilots who had hundreds of hours of training and combat experience. The primary defense of German cities had devolved to the Flak arm. The legendary 88mm anti-aircraft gun, along with heavier 128mm batteries, ringed major cities. These guns fired highly explosive fragmentation shells, timed to detonate at the precise altitude of the bomber formations. The Flak did not aim at individual planes. It fired into a predetermined box of airspace, creating a barrage of deadly steel shrapnel. But the sheer industrial disparity was staggering. Look at the manufacturing numbers. In the United States, the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan was churning out a B-24 Liberator every single hour. American factories were producing aircraft, bombs, and high-octane aviation fuel at a rate that defied human comprehension. The logistics required to support the 8th Air Force in England were mind-boggling. We are talking about shipping millions of gallons of fuel, millions of tons of steel, aluminum, and high explosives across the Atlantic Ocean, dodging U-boats just to sustain the daily operations of thousands of aircraft. It was a triumph of the American supply chain, a testament to the fact that modern wars are won by the side with the deepest factories and the most robust logistics. As February 1945 approached, the weather over Europe, which had grounded fleets for weeks and hampered operations during the Battle of the Bulge, finally began to show signs of clearing. The target folders were finalized. The intelligence officers briefed the crews. The armourers in East Anglia began the back-breaking work of winching 500-pound ANM-64 general-purpose bombs and M47 incendiary clusters into the bellies of the fortresses and liberators. The crews, young men from farms in Iowa, streets in Brooklyn, and ranches in Texas, zipped up their heavy, sheepskin-lined leather flight suits. They knew they were stepping into unpressurized aluminum tubes, where the temperature at 25,000 feet would drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. They knew that frostbite was as deadly an enemy as German flak. The machinery of total annihilation was fully fueled, armed, and waiting for the green flare from the control tower. The green flares arced into the damp English night, and the immense logistical machine ground into motion. Starting thousands of heavy aircraft engines in the dark, taxiing them along narrow perimeter tracks and launching them at 1-minute intervals is an industrial ballet fraught with the constant peril of fiery collisions. Just getting a heavy bomber group into the air and formed up was a grueling, fuel-burning ordeal. Imagine trying to merge 1,000 semi-trucks onto a single-lane highway in pitch blackness in the sky while carrying tons of high explosives. The pilots of the Royal Air Force Bomber Command hauled back on the yokes of their Lancaster bombers, fighting the immense torque of 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines as they lumbered into the freezing air. This was the night of February 13th, 1945, and the first phase of the annihilation of Dresden was officially underway. We have to examine the precise cocktail of ordnance these aircraft were carrying, because destroying a sprawling European city is not achieved by simply dropping random explosives. It requires a mathematically calculated, highly specific sequence of destruction. The British strategy for urban area bombing relied on a brutal 1-2 punch designed to exploit the very architecture of the target. The first element was the blast bomb, specifically the high-capacity 4,000-pound HC Mark II, affectionately and terrifyingly known by the crews as the Cookie. This was not an aerodynamic, armor-piercing weapon. It was essentially a massive steel cylinder packed to the brim with over 2,500 pounds of Amatol high explosive. Its casing was deliberately thin. The tactical objective of the Cookie was not penetration. It was sheer, unadulterated surface blast effect. When a Cookie detonated, it generated a massive supersonic shockwave that swept through the city streets. This shockwave was designed to shatter windows, blow the heavy tile roofs off buildings, and splinter the wooden doors and window frames. In military terms, this is called opening up the target. You have to ask yourself, what is the point of dropping fire on a city if the buildings are sealed up tight? You have to crack the structures open to expose the combustible wooden skeletons underneath. Once the blast bombs had ripped the roofs off the city, the second element of the payload was unleashed. These were the incendiaries. The RAF carried hundreds of thousands of 4-pound magnesium incendiary sticks, bundled together in massive clusters. When these clusters deployed, they scattered the burning magnesium sticks across a wide area. Magnesium burns at an incredibly high temperature, nearly 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and it cannot be extinguished with water. If you spray water on a magnesium fire, the intense heat actually splits the water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen, creating an explosive reaction that only feeds the flames. Alongside the magnesium were larger 100-pound bombs filled with white phosphorus, a chemical that ignites spontaneously upon contact with the air and burns right through roof timbers, floors, and flesh. The blast bombs created the kindling, and the incendiary bombs provided the spark. But how do you find a single train yard or a specific urban centre in the pitch black of a European winter from 20,000 feet? You do not use your eyes, you use physics and specialised pathfinding tactics. The RAF utilised an elite group known as the Pathfinder Force. Flying ahead of the main bomber stream in fast, high-altitude de Havilland Mosquitoes and specialized Lancasters, the Pathfinders used advanced ground-mapping radar systems like H2S to locate the target through the cloud cover. Once they identified the aiming point, they dropped brilliant colored flares known as target indicators or TIRs. These tiers burned with intense red and green colors, floating down on parachutes to mark the exact drop zones for the hundreds of heavy bombers following behind. Circling above this entire chaotic scene was the master bomber, a highly experienced pilot in a Mosquito who orchestrated the attack over a radio frequency, calling out adjustments and telling the incoming waves exactly which colored flares to bomb. If we look for a historical parallel, this is the exact same concept as a modern forward air controller in the Vietnam War, orbiting in an O-2 Skymaster and firing white phosphorus rockets to mark targets for incoming F-4 Phantoms, just scaled up to a massive, apocalyptic level. At exactly 10:13 at night, the first wave of the attack, consisting of 244 Lancasters of No. 5 Group, arrived over Dresden. The Pathfinders had done their job perfectly. The sky was illuminated by a brilliant canopy of red and green magnesium flares. The master bomber gave the order, and the bomb bays opened. Within a span of just 15 minutes, this first wave dumped over 800 tons of bombs directly onto the historic city centre and the adjacent marshalling yards. The initial bombardment functioned exactly as the grim tactical doctrine dictated. The massive blast from the 4,000-pound cookies stripped the roofs off thousands of buildings, creating a landscape of open, splintered timber. Then, the thousands of incendiaries rained down, lodging in the exposed attics and shattered living rooms. Within minutes, thousands of individual fires began to take hold across the city. The true horror of the Dresden attack, however, was engineered by the timing of the second wave. The RAF deliberately scheduled a massive follow-up strike 3 hours after the initial attack. There was a cold, calculated logic to this pause. 3 hours was the exact amount of time required for the local fire departments, the emergency rescue crews, and the civil defense teams from surrounding towns to mobilize and converge on the burning city center. By timing the second wave for 1:30 in the morning on February 14th, the RAF ensured that the maximum number of German emergency responders would be caught entirely exposed in the streets. 529 Lancasters roared over the burning city. The target was no longer marked by flares. It was marked by a raging inferno visible from 100 miles away. This second wave dropped an additional 1,800 tons of high explosives and incendiaries directly into the existing blaze. This immense concentration of thermal energy triggered a horrifying meteorological phenomenon known as a firestorm. We have seen this before in American history, most notably during the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, or the Peshtigo Fire, where the sheer volume of heat creates its own localized weather system. But in Dresden, the firestorm was artificially induced and mathematically scaled. As the thousands of individual fires merged into a single massive conflagration, the intense heat caused the air above the city to rise rapidly, creating a massive thermal column. This rising column of hot air created a vacuum at ground level. To fill this vacuum, cold air from the surrounding countryside was sucked into the city centre at hurricane speeds, reaching over 150 miles per hour. This massive influx of oxygen acted like a giant bellows, feeding the flames and driving the temperatures up to an astonishing 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was so powerful that it physically sucked people into the burning buildings and uprooted trees. The intense heat literally melted the glass in the windows and turned the asphalt streets into a boiling, sticky trap. For those who sought refuge in the deep underground cellars, the firestorm offered no mercy. The massive combustion process consumed almost all the oxygen in the air, replacing it with deadly carbon monoxide. Thousands suffocated silently in their shelters, their bodies completely untouched by the flames, but baked by the ambient heat. As dawn broke on February 14th, the RAF bombers were landing back in England, their massive tires smoking on the tarmac. But the assault was far from over. The American doctrine of round-the-clock bombing meant that as the British slept, the United States Army Air Forces took over the shift. Over 300 B-17 Flying Fortresses of the mighty 8th Air Force, escorted by hundreds of P-51 Mustangs, were already climbing through the freezing overcast over the English Channel. Their target was the Dresden marshalling yards, the vital rail links that the Germans desperately needed to move troops to the Eastern Front. But as the American bomber stream approached the city, they were confronted by a massive, impenetrable column of thick black smoke rising to an altitude of 15,000 feet. The visual aiming points were completely obscured. The highly touted Norden bomb sight, the optical marvel that was supposed to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet, was absolutely useless if the bombardier could not see the ground. This forced the American formations to rely on their H2X radar systems, known as Mickey sets. The H2X was a ground-mapping radar that emitted a pulse of radio energy and measured the return signal. Water, open ground, and dense urban structures all returned different signatures on the radar operator's cathode ray tube. However, bombing through dense smoke via early 1940s radar technology was far from precision work. It was essentially area bombing by default. At noon, the B-17 opened their bomb bay doors and released over 700 tons of high explosives, aiming blindly through the smoke column at the radar returns that indicated the vast rail yards. Due to the inherent inaccuracy of radar bombing, the bomb pattern was scattered widely across the already devastated city, further compounding the destruction and killing rescue workers who had survived the night. While the heavy bombers pounded the infrastructure from high altitude, the American fighter escorts executed a different, highly aggressive tactical mission. With the Luftwaffe largely absent from the sky, the P-51 Mustangs dropped down to the deck. Their mission was armed reconnaissance and interdiction. They fanned out across the Saxon countryside, hunting for targets of opportunity. This is a classic cavalry tactic. Think of Union General Philip Sheridan's cavalry tearing up Confederate rail lines and shooting up supply wagons during the Appomattox campaign. The Mustangs, armed with 650 caliber machine guns, strafed locomotives, rail cars, vehicle convoys, and anything that moved on the roads leading into and out of Dresden. The objective was total paralysis of the transport network. A locomotive boiler struck by armor-piercing incendiary rounds from a P-51 would explode violently, permanently disabling the train and blocking the vital rail arteries. The strafing was chaotic, brutal, and highly effective at ensuring that even if the marshalling yards survived, the rolling stock required to move the German army was systematically dismantled on the tracks. The combined weight of the British night attack and the American daylight follow-up had delivered over 3,900 tons of high explosives and incendiaries onto a single urban centre in less than 14 hours. The tactical execution was flawless, a masterclass in the grim science of industrial destruction. The marshalling yards were a tangled mess of twisted steel and cratered tracks. The city centre was a smouldering, unrecognisable wasteland. The immediate military objective of severing the logistical artery to the Eastern Front had been violently achieved. However, the sheer scale of the devastation, the staggering loss of human life, and the undeniable reality of an entire city wiped from the map in a single night were about to trigger a massive shockwave. As the smoke finally began to clear over the ruins of Dresden, the true cost of this total war doctrine was laid bare, forcing commanders and politicians alike to confront the terrifying monster they had unleashed from the sky. The assessment of the smoldering ruins on the morning of February 15th was not merely a matter of counting shattered buildings. It was a cold, calculated evaluation of kinetic impact versus strategic objective. When you strip away the emotion and look strictly at the military data, the immediate aftermath of the Dresden raid presents a complex web of intelligence, logistics, and brutal geopolitical calculus. The Allied intelligence apparatus, heavily reliant on the top-secret Ultra program that deciphered German Enigma communications, had been tracking the desperate movement of the Wehrmacht. The intelligence officers sitting in secure bunkers in Bletchley Park and Washington knew exactly what the German High Command was attempting to do. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of the German armored forces, was frantically trying to shift the 6th Panzer Army and other mechanized reserves from the collapsed Ardennes front in the west to the crumbling Vistula-Oder line in the east. Dresden was the vital choke point for this massive redeployment. The tactical lesson here is fundamental to mechanized warfare. A panzer division is a terrifying instrument of combat power on an open field. But while it is strapped to flatbed rail cars, moving through a bottleneck at 10 miles per hour, it is completely helpless. By obliterating the Dresden marshalling yards, the Allied air forces effectively pinned down German armored reserves, forcing them to detrain miles away from the front lines and consume their precious, highly limited reserves of synthetic gasoline just to reach the battlefield. But we must ask ourselves, did the sheer scale of the destruction match the military necessity? To answer this, we have to pull back the lens and look at the grand strategic and political environment of February 1945. Just days before the bombers launched, the Big Three, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, met at the Yalta Conference in the Crimea. This was not just a meeting to plan the end of the war, it was the opening chess match of the Cold War. The Soviet Red Army was taking horrific casualties, pushing toward Berlin, and Stalin directly demanded that the Western Allies use their massive strategic bomber fleets to paralyze the rail hubs in eastern Germany, specifically naming Berlin, Leipzig, and Dresden. The unleashing of 1,500 heavy bombers was therefore not just a tactical strike, it was a massive geopolitical signal. The United States and Great Britain were demonstrating to the Soviet Union the terrifying, unparalleled reach of their industrial military complex. It was a violent display of leverage, proving that the Western Allies possessed the capability to reach out and completely erase a major urban center from the map in a matter of hours. To truly grasp the magnitude of this operation, you have to look at the staggering logistical tale required to make it happen. The air war over Europe was the most expensive military campaign in human history up to that point. Consider the fuel consumption alone. A single Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, cruising at altitude, burned roughly 200 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel every single hour. When you put 1,000 American heavy bombers and 800 British Lancasters into the air for an 8 to 10 hour round trip, you are burning millions of gallons of fuel in a single night. Every drop of that fuel, every single 500-pound bomb, every belt of 50-caliber ammunition had to be manufactured in places like Detroit, St. Louis, and Los Angeles, loaded onto Liberty ships, transported across a submarine-infested Atlantic Ocean, unloaded at British ports and transported by rail to the airfields in East Anglia. The ground crews, the unsung heroes of the air campaign, worked in freezing mud, using hand cranks and sheer muscle to winch thousands of tons of explosives into the bomb bays. They patched flak holes with sheet metal and rivets in the dead of night, working in temperatures that froze the grease on their tools. The economic strangulation of Germany was only made possible by the overwhelming, unstoppable economic engine of the United States. When we analyze the tactical evolution of this campaign, we must compare it to other pivotal moments in military history to understand its true context. The firebombing of Dresden was not an isolated anomaly. It was the grim perfection of a specific doctrine of total war. Less than a month later, in March 1945, American Major General Curtis LeMay would take this exact same blueprint of artificial firestorms and apply it to the Pacific Theater. During Operation Meeting House, LeMay stripped the defensive guns off of his B-29 superfortresses, loaded them entirely with M69 napalm incendiary clusters, and sent them in at low altitude, at night, over Tokyo. The resulting firestorm in Tokyo killed over 100,000 people and burned 16 square miles of the city to ash, proving that the aerial annihilation tactics refined over Germany were highly exportable. We can also look further back to the American Civil War, specifically to General Ulysses S. Grant's siege of Petersburg in 1864. Grant understood that he did not need to destroy Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in a single pitched battle. Instead, he systematically cut the rail lines supplying Petersburg and Richmond, starving the Confederate Army of food, ammunition, and reinforcements until it simply collapsed. The strategic bombing of German rail hubs like Dresden was the exact same logistical strangulation, elevated to 25,000 feet and executed with high explosives. However, the legacy of Dresden forced a massive re-evaluation of airpower doctrine that continues to shape the United States military today. Did the obliteration of the city center actually break the will of the German people? Historically, the concept of terror bombing, the idea that you can bomb a civilian population into demanding surrender, has almost always failed. Just as the German Blitz on London in 1940 only hardened British resolve, the destruction of German cities often left the survivors with nothing left to lose and nowhere to turn but toward the fanatical state apparatus. The immense collateral damage of area bombing was a product of technological limitation. In 1945, to guarantee the destruction of a single railway bridge or a specific factory, you had to drop thousands of bombs from hundreds of aircraft, accepting that 90% of them would miss the precise target and obliterate the surrounding neighborhoods. Contrast this blunt, sledgehammer approach with the opening night of Operation Desert Storm in 1991. A single American F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter, penetrating Iraqi airspace undetected, could drop a single 2,000-pound laser-guided bomb directly down the ventilation shaft of a command bunker. The technological leap from the unguided area bombing of Dresden to the precision-guided munitions of the modern era was driven directly by the desire to achieve the strategic effect of 1945 without the horrific, indiscriminate slaughter of the civilian population. The ultimate lesson of the Dresden raid is a chilling testament to the nature of industrialized warfare. When a nation completely mobilizes its economy, its science, and its manpower for the sole purpose of destroying its enemy, the traditional lines between the battlefield and the home front completely evaporate. The factory worker assembling a tank is deemed as valid a target as the soldier driving it. The rail yard moving the ammunition becomes indistinguishable from the artillery battery firing it. The unleashing of 1,500 heavy bombers was the logical, mathematical conclusion of a war where survival dictated that the enemy's capacity to wage war must be systematically dismantled, brick by brick, rail by rail. It forces us to look into the abyss of total war and recognize that the machinery of destruction, once fully activated and fueled by the righteous necessity of victory, possesses a terrifying momentum that is almost impossible to restrain. As we close this deep dive into one of the most controversial and devastating air operations in human history, we are left with a profound realization about the evolution of conflict. The sky, once a sanctuary of clouds and starlight, was permanently transformed into a third dimension of total war, a place where the industrial might of nations clashed with a ferocity that forever changed the calculus of human survival. Now, I want to hear your perspective on the strategic doctrine of the heavy bomber campaign. Which of the following factors do you believe was the most critical in breaking the German war machine from the air? A. The destruction of the rail networks and logistical hubs. B. The systematic targeting of the synthetic oil and fuel refineries. C. The relentless attrition of the Luftwaffe's experienced fighter pilots. Drop your answer in the comments below. Let me know your thoughts, and I will see you in the next analysis.